Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is July 9th, 2018. This is our 8th podcast. Again, I am excited. This is a wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts and opinions, feelings, and whatnot with you. I am Ben Wood Johnson, and we're going to be debating the concept of rationality. In this particular podcast, I am going to discuss the difference between rationality and emotionality. Now, this is one of the most important topics we're going to debate in these podcasts. The reason this is important is because the concept of rationality is the foundation of society. It is this understanding that a person is rational at his core, and whatever the person does or does not do is a choice that the person makes and whatnot. So we're going to be talking about the concept of choice in other podcasts, but for now, let us focus on the concept of rationality versus emotionality. It is well known that men are rational beings, right? In this podcast, I argue to the contrary. I believe that men are not inherently rational. Men have to learn to be rational. They have to learn, yet they have to become rational at a certain point. I sort of talk about the notion of rationality. I dissect how the person tends to react to his or her emotions. So in that sense, men are not rational. This is a 2-part series, but for this particular week, we sort of introduced the concept and talked about how I believe that men are not rational, rather they are emotional. So stay tuned, and without further ado, let's get to it. Almost every author who has had the opportunity to analyze man always comes down to the understanding that men are rational animals. But I think men are not rational. Rather, men are emotional. Now, the difference between rationality and emotionality is that one relies on one's understanding of the environment. In the other case, one relies on the understanding of the self within the environment. In order for men to be rational, men would have to be able to understand themselves in relationship to every other being within the environment. In other words, men would have to understand their relationship with the trees, the forests, with everything within the environment. So, if men were rational animals, men would not kill, for instance. Killing is one aspect about humanity, or about humankind itself, which is based on emotions. The killing of a living being is a natural instinct. It is based on how one feels at a particular time, whether it is a feeling of hunger, whether it is a feeling of fear, whatever that feeling might be. Human beings generally kill because they feel that something could happen to them. In other words, there is a sense of fear, a sense of an impending doom. Rationality is different. Under a rational regimen, men would be able to explain their actions. It would not necessarily be an explanation for their emotions. Rather, it would be a logical explanation for what they do. What is generally considered as logic in humanity is emotions, right? So the line between emotions and logic is blurry. So the concept of logic is exogenous to men. In other words, it is exogenous to men's nature. So men are not inherently logical. Men have to become logical at a certain time, in a particular situation, under a specific circumstance. But what we have to understand is that men were built to be emotional. Every fiber, everything about man is based on emotions. It is based on sensory emotions about the environment or where men evolve. So everything men do is based on how they sense their environment. Men are aware of the environment. And the reason is that men are within the environment. Men are part of the environment. Men are aware of the environment to a point where they could overreact to the environment. Right? But men are not always aware of their awareness of the environment. So that's why men always attempt to justify their actions or the actions that they pose within the environment. So it is a way for man to confirm to men that they were aware of themselves within the environment when they did what they did. So in other words, men could tell themselves whatever they did, well, they were supposed to do that. So that could be understood as emotions. It's a way of justifying one's feelings. Rationality, on the other hand, is not like that. Under a rational regimen, there's no need for justifications. Because if it is right, if it is just, if it is fair, it is because it is fair. It is because it is right. It is because it is just. There is no need to justify one's actions if such actions are rational. In other words, if it's been done, it is because it was supposed to be done. When we're talking about rationality, we're talking about men's capacity to understand their place in nature. In other words, a person must understand what his or her being is within nature. The individual must also understand what the other beings within nature are, where they are, and why they are. It is in that understanding that man or the person would be able to gauge him or herself, to gauge the others, and to understand the relationship that he or she entertains with the other. It is this back and forth between the being and the other that men or the individual would be able to rationalize what he does or what he doesn't do to the other the same way. The individual would be able to probe what the other does to him or what the other doesn't do to him in relationship to where they are on the scale of nature. A man would understand that a cat, a lion, or a dog, a horse, a zebra, a crocodile, a bird, or any living entity within nature has feelings, right? A rational person would understand that every living being has feelings. Every living being has a sensory understanding of the world the same way that he does. So the person would know that if I can think, if I can walk, if I can talk, well, other living beings do the same thing, but they probably do it in their own way. So if I am conveying messages via language, the lion is probably doing the same thing, but in its own way, right? So the lion does not have to talk the way I do, but that doesn't mean that the lion does not communicate in a way that another lion understands. The problem is that men do not always see other beings in nature as they are. If men were rational, they would be able to see that every other living being within nature has his own capacity, has its own ability to be. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every other living being in nature is the same as a person. And saying that, I'm not suggesting that there's a certain superiority in the being himself. But what I'm suggesting here is that if men were rational, they would understand that the fact that they are, others are also. In other words, if I am, it is because we are. And if we are, it's because we could be. And if we could be, then there's a possibility that we might not be. And this is the whole concept of logic, where we have to understand the possibility of something in relation to the possibility that something might not be. And that's what logic is. Logic is that when it is rational, when it is provable, when you can say that it could happen, at the same time you could say, this is why it couldn't happen. Men are not inherently like that. Men have to become rational over time. Men are born animalistic, to put it this way. If men were able to gauge themselves in the environment, they would be able to gauge others and understand that others are able to gauge him in a certain way. In other words, the same way I could look at a lion, I could engage the lion, I can see the lion, I can feel the lion, or I could try to fight the lion if need be. Well, the lion might feel the same way for me. The lion might see me. The lion might engage me. The lion might see me as a threat, the same way I see it as a threat. The same way I might try to eliminate the threat the lion poses to me. Okay? Of course, those feelings would be expressed via different mechanisms. Okay? But the idea is that if men could be, so could others. Let us say you have an animal, whether a pet or a wild animal. Okay? And you decide to remove that animal from its natural habitat, from its natural environment, and you put it somewhere. Let's say you decide to turn this animal into a pet, into a house animal, or I'm going to put it in a zoo or something, into a cage somewhere, right? Now, we often justify this act by saying we're doing something good for the pet. But in reality, this is an irrational act. This is an irrational way of looking at the world, because from our perspective, that animal would suit our needs. But that does not necessarily mean that that would suit the animal's needs, right? So what we say is that we want to put this animal in a cage, or we want to put this animal, we want to keep this animal in the house to serve our purpose, right? That's not rational. That's emotional, okay? It's our feeling, it's our need that takes over. Now, we're not going to go in detail and the whole concept of need, but the idea I'm trying to convey here is the understanding that we don't do because we are rational. We do because we are emotional. We always try to fill our needs. We always try to fulfill our emotions, our necessity to feel either feel safe, whether to feel, to satisfy a hunger, to satisfy a desire and whatnot, okay? So at the end of the day, it is not rationality, rather it's emotionality, or emotions, if you will. It wouldn't be a display of rationality if you believe that an animal would want you to cage it. If you think that the cat would want you to keep it in the house, that's not rationality. If you think the dog would want you to put it in a crate, in a cage or whatnot, that's not rationality. If you think the lion would want you to put it in a cave somewhere, in a zoo, whatever, to satisfy your pleasure of seeing the lion, well, that's not rationality. Okay, so we have to take all of these into account when we're talking about rationality versus emotionality.